Okay, calm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. We have a great show for you today. I talked to Jim DiEugenio about who killed Martin Luther King, and then I talked to anti-Zionist Holocaust survivor Peter Cohen. But before I start, please remember to like the stream, to share the stream, and to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And that to do that, you hit subscribe and then you press the bell. And please do support the show on Patreon. That's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Without your support, we literally could not do this show. And for $1 a month, you make the show happen. For $5 a month, you make the show happen, and you get tons of extended and extra episodes and interviews. For this week, the Patreon is really cool. It's some great interviews that I did at the first ever Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress, which I just attended in Vienna. But without any further ado, we're going to start with my first interview that I recorded, and that is with Jim DiEugenio. He's a researcher and writer who focuses on the political assassinations of the 1960s, including the killing of JFK. He's been on the show before with the great director Oliver Stone, and they have collaborated on the JFK documentary. He is the author of 2 books, Destiny Betrayed and the JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today. And he's the co-author of the book, The Assassinations. And he was the co-editor of Probe magazine. I want to ask you, Jim, about how you started looking into all of this. What made you interested in this theme? You don't just focus on JFK, you focus on assassinations from the 1960s. So what was your kind of personal political trajectory? And then I would love to hear you talk more about the assassination of Martin Luther King and the relationship between the Kennedys and the Kings.
I got interested in this because I first read the Jim Garrison interview in Playboy magazine, not when it was published, which I believe is in 67, but I read it many, many years later. And I thought it was very fascinating. And I thought, geez, I think this guy's making a lot of sense to me. And so I had a mild interest then. And then when I went to film school, my partner at the time said, why don't you write a script? And I said, about what? He said, well, what's something that you think would be really interesting? And it was a Kennedy assassination. And I thought we could tell the story through Jim Garrison. So one day I'm at the newsstand, I pick up Variety, and I see Oliver Stone has purchased the rights to Jim Garrison's. And I go, Rob, there goes that idea. Okay. There's no way we're going to beat him. Okay. And so then I turned it into my first book, which I don't advise anybody to read because it's not a very good book. All right. The revised edition is much better. Okay. So then I started contributing to a magazine called Probe. And since 1993, I published 3 books, the screenplay to JFK Revisited. And then I was a contributor to this last book, which I think you're reading, the JFK Assassination Chokeholds. And I also have a website, Kennedys and King, and I also have a Substack site. And so this is what I mainly focus on, because when I first got into this, I was focused on the JFK case. And it never touched upon me that maybe they're all related. And I thought that was a dumb idea myself. Okay. But this was the more I started studying them, the more I began to realize, hey, I think these are all related. Okay. You know, do you think it's really a coincidence to knock off the 4 biggest and best leftist leaders of the 1960s in a space of 5 years under such suspicious circumstances?
That would be JFK, RFK, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King.
Right. You know, can that just be a coincidence? And so as the more I began to delve into them, the more I began to write about all 4. I began to write about all 4 cases, you know, and I'm glad that the executive order does also include the King case and the RFK assassination.
And so what are the connections? I mean, who is responsible for these assassinations?
Okay. One of the things when you delve into these things is that you understand that the official story is not true. Okay. And then you understand that not only is the official story not true, but somebody snapped on a cover up, okay, very, very quickly to make sure that the true facts were not told. And then you discover that this cover up came from Washington. All right. For example, in the Robert Kennedy assassination, the two guys who were put in charge of the Sirhan case were both former CIA agents. Okay. Hernandez and Pena. All right. And they did everything they could to conceal what the true facts of that particular case were and are. All right. In the King case, the FBI snapped off a cover up, right at the beginning. The Attorney General Ramsey Clark, within one day, the case is over. We have a lone gunman, and it's this James Earl Ray guy. All right. So these are kind of the common threads, the manipulation of these, what we call fall guys. All right. And then the invasion from Washington to snap on a cover up right at the beginning. Now, the Robert Kennedy case, for example, that particular case, when people get exposed to it, which they aren't, the problem is that unlike the JFK case, where you had an autopsy was just god awful, all right, in the Robert Kennedy case, Noguchi's autopsy was first rate, all right, and he consulted with Cyril Wecht, the late Cyril Wecht, about how he should conduct this thing, and he said, bring in some observers so they can all tell what you're doing, and he did, all right, and he came to the conclusion that all the projectiles that entered Robert Kennedy came in from behind, which is physically impossible if Sirhan is the lone gunman, because he's always in front of Kennedy. And the fatal wound, the wound at the rear of the skull, came in at what he called point contact range, which means from 1 to 3 inches. And the way he figured this out was it had powder burns encircling the wound, which means the gun had to be jammed up very closely because the gunpowder did not have anywhere to escape to. So it went in to the skin. No one put Sirhan at that close range into Robert Kennedy. All right. Now, this is all important for not just these forensic reasons, not for CSI reasons, but I also believe for political reasons. Unlike what Chris Hedges once said on, I don't know what that might have been your old show, Rising. I think he said it.
Oh yeah, I appeared on it. Then they fired me, but yeah, maybe yeah.
Okay, I think it was on his show. He said that Robert Kennedy hated Martin Luther King. Oh my God! If anybody has seen the speech that Robert Kennedy made the night that Martin Luther King was shot, how anybody objective could say that Robert Kennedy hated Martin. That was the best speech Robert Kennedy ever made. And the place where he made it in, Indianapolis, that was the only major city that did not go up in smoke in the wake of the riots that followed King's assassination. Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, the March on Washington that's usually considered the high point of American liberalism post World War II. All right. No white politician in Washington supported that demonstration until John F. Kennedy came out in public for it. And then after he came out in public for it, he told his brother, you're going to be supervising this thing, because if this thing goes awry, we're going to be dead. Okay. All right. We can't afford to do that. And so Robert Kennedy actually supervised that whole March on Washington speech. And the only reason that JFK did not speak that day is because they didn't want him to. The leaders of the demonstration didn't want him to, for practical reasons. You know, they said, if he comes on, he's going to overshadow us. Okay. So let's not put him on so he doesn't steal the show. Okay. And so that's the reason that he wasn't there. But he was the only guy, him and his brother, who were full out behind that demonstration. You know, when JFK came into office, very little had been done on civil rights. And I'm talking about FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower. They accomplished very little in that venue. Eisenhower and Nixon did this deliberately, you know, for political reasons. All right. To give you an example of how this changed, the day that JFK was inaugurated, he called up his Secretary of the Treasury, Douglas Dillon, and he said, "Why were there no black faces in that Coast Guard parade today?" And Dillon said, "I don't know." And Kennedy says, "Well, find out." So at the first cabinet meeting, JFK said, "I want everybody to bring in a chart next time. And I want to know people of color in your department. And I want to know how many, and I want to know where they're at." So they did. And he looks at these things and he's shocked at A, how few they are. And secondly, how they're all located at the bottom of the hierarchy. From that, Kennedy wrote the first affirmative action order in the history of the United States in March of 1961. Then he wrote a second one after that. The first one was for all government positions. The second one was for all contracting positions. In other words, if you did business with the government, you had to follow affirmative action guidelines. So for the first time in a place like North Carolina, they had to hire African-American workers. All right.
But one thing I would just bring up is, you know, there is the, I guess one of the things, I don't know if Chris Hedges mentions this, but RFK, I guess, approved wiretaps of Martin Luther King's phone.
Oh, okay. All right. You want to get to that?
Sure, yeah.
J. Edgar Hoover was, probably don't have to tell you this. He was almost messianic with his opposition to King. All right. And he did everything he possibly could, including trying to get him to take his own life under threat. Okay. To try and get him to stop. And his ace in the hole card was that he was going to expose the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as being a communist front. All right. And he actually threatened the Kennedys with putting these in friendly newspapers that there were communists inside the SCLC. All right. So Robert Kennedy, in desperation, said, "All right, look, I will agree to these phone taps and we will do them for 30 days. And if nothing comes in, this is all over."
Mm.
Okay. So that was the agreement. Now, here was the problem. At the end of the 30 days, his brother got assassinated. All right. And so with that, there's the legendary story about Hoover going in to Kennedy's outer office and ripping the phone out. Okay. And then refusing to answer his phone calls anymore, et cetera. So Robert Kennedy was powerless to do anything about it. All right. Because now without his brother, he didn't have the guardrail protecting him. That is how that started. All right. All right. It's because Hoover essentially went ahead, and when he couldn't come up with anything, he broke the deal because there was no JFK there to protect him. All right.
And so, I mean, I think a lot of people don't know that there was already a civil case regarding the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Oh, yes. Well, there was actually a trial. All right. The King family, are you familiar with who Joe Brown was?
Yeah.
And is? Yeah, okay. Judge Joe Brown down there in Memphis, the case fell to him when the late William Pepper wanted to reopen the murder case against James Earl Ray. And Brown agreed to go ahead. All right, we'll have rifle tests. Okay. And if the rifle comes back that it wasn't the right rifle, we'll reopen the case. Well, when he said that, okay, the same thing happened to him as happened to Jim Garrison. You know, the entire, if you remember, the whole media establishment, okay, suddenly waved the red flags, you know, and said, no, this is not going to happen. All right. And Joe Brown was removed from the case. So Pepper could not prosecute it on a felony level. So what happened was that the King family agreed to file a civil suit against a guy named Loyd Jowers, who actually said that he was an unwitting accomplice to the conspiracy to murder Martin Luther King. And so this civil case was actually allowed to proceed. And let me tell you an interesting sidelight about the coverage of this case. Court TV, which I believe was called True TV back then, all right, they were going to broadcast this as one of their very first productions. And so Jim Douglas, who was reporting on it for us,
For Probe,
for Probe, okay, he was there and he was talking to the guy from True TV. Okay, and the guy from True, hey, this is going to be really good, isn't it? Okay. Jim told us the day before the trial was supposed to start, True TV disappeared. Okay, they weren't there. And in fact, no reporter, no American reporter was in the courtroom every day except him. Jim Douglas was the only guy who was there every day for the proceedings. It was to show you how bad it was. The guy who had been covering it for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, he would wait for Jim every day to come out of the courtroom so he could get the story, because they wouldn't allow him to be in the courtroom to cover the trial. Well, and there was a very good reason, because Pepper won the case. All right. And he presented a lot of very good evidence, which Jim ended up reporting for us. All right. But it wasn't in any of the other newspapers. And in fact, what the mainstream media did, if you remember, they put Gerald Posner on the case. Posner had published a book about the King case right before the trial, and he's a guy who made the rounds to all the, like the New York Times, etc., and he reported on the Martin Luther King case. A guy who wasn't even there. Okay, he's the guy that the MSM sent out on it, because they did not want this evidence that won the case to be put out there. That's how desperate they were.
And can you summarize what the evidence was and what it proved?
Okay, well, the official story has James Earl Ray in this communal bathroom at this low-level hotel, all right, shooting off this rifle to get off one shot against King, who had come out on the balcony of his room. Well, no credible witness ever saw James Earl Ray do such a thing. And the one credible witness who did see it said he didn't do it. That there was a guy who came out of the room, but it wasn't James Earl Ray. Now, the other interesting part of that story is that in order for this to have happened, somebody had to have gone to Lorraine Motel and changed the reservation, because the original booking was for an interior courtyard room. All right, which this could have never happened if that would have been followed through on. Somebody went to that hotel saying that they were from Martin Luther King's entourage and changed his room to the front of the building with a balcony. And this, of course, is what went ahead and made it possible. Now, another thing that Pepper brought up was that some very credible witnesses said the shot didn't even come from where the official story said James Earl Ray took the shot from, right? That it actually came from the other side in a bushy area across the street. Now, what is so interesting about that is that the Parks Department the next morning chopped down all the bushes. So you couldn't see how a guy could cover himself in those bushes. All right. Now, one of the men in charge of that was a guy named Holloman. I think his name was Frank Holloman. Frank Holloman worked for J. Edgar Hoover for over 7 years as his executive assistant. All right. And he was very reluctant to talk about that at all. Another factor, in addition to this, that he brought up, that Pepper brought up, is that when King came to Memphis, he had a special detail that was in charge of his security. All right. They would escort him around every place. That detail was canceled. All right. For this particular visit. All right. Now, another thing he brought out was that the reason King was there was there had been a mini riot when he had visited the city earlier, the sanitation workers' strike.
Right.
A lot of people believe this was provoked by a kind of Black Panther copycat group called the Marauders. If you take a look at the famous picture of King dying on the balcony, a guy named Merrill McCullough was the first guy, or one of the first people, to be on that balcony. He was the leader of the Marauders. It later turned out that Merrill McCullough was a CIA agent. All right. It later came out. And in fact, here's a funny story. When Sam Donaldson, when he heard this rumor at that time, because McCullough began as a police informant, then I think went to the FBI, then went to the CIA. When Sam Donaldson heard this story, he didn't believe it. All right. So he calls up CIA headquarters, and the desk officer answers, and he goes, "Do you have a Merrill McCullough that works there?" And the guy goes through the whole list and goes, "Yeah, it looks like we do." All right. And he goes, "Can you get him for me?" So he connects him with Merrill McCullough. And Donaldson says, "Are you the same Merrill McCullough that is on that famous picture of King dying on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel?" And he said, "Yes, it was him." So, I mean, how much more suspicious can you get? You know, you got the room being changed. You got the shot coming from the opposite direction. You got the woman saying, no, it wasn't James Earl Ray. And you have Merrill McCullough, who very likely might have provoked the whole thing. You know, at least there are some suggestions of that. So as Pepper is putting forth all this stuff in court, and he's proving it, and on top of that, he's proving that there was a military intelligence detail, all right, that was domestically working, and they were following King around, all right, in the early spring of 1968. And in fact, they had actually sent military officers into the local police department, manning desks at the time. And here's the capper. There's a firehouse across the street from the Lorraine Motel. Pepper produced a witness that said, on the day of King's assassination, two of these guys came to the firehouse, all right, and they said, "Can you escort us to the stairs that will take us to the rooftop?" All right. And unsuspectingly, yeah, we do have a rooftop entrance, okay? He leads them up to the rooftop. All right. What on earth would be the purpose of doing such a thing on that day? It just happened to be coincidentally on that day. Last thing, James Earl Ray had always insisted that he was set up by this guy named Raoul, who he met up in Canada. I believe that it was at a bar in either Montreal or Toronto. I think it was in Montreal. And so he said Raoul had sent him on these missions throughout the United States. And it was involved with gun running. All right. And so he would pay him very handsomely after he completed these missions. And he said it was Raoul who sent him to Memphis. All right. Nobody could figure out if this was true or false. Pepper produced 3 witnesses who had met this very same Raoul. So in other words, James Earl Ray was not making something up. There really was a Raoul manipulating him around the country and putting him in this terrible position. All right. And on that day, Loyd Jowers' initial story was that it was this guy who handed him the rifle to give to another guy to do the actual shooting of King. So what Pepper was doing was really putting together a whole kind of uncovered mosaic, all right, that actually made sense and fit together like pieces of a puzzle. And James Earl Ray was not a part of it. And that's why the civil case came in favor of Pepper, the plaintiff in that case. And it didn't take a long time either. It just took several hours, for the jury to come back and saying that there was a conspiracy to murder Martin Luther King.
And so who took part in that conspiracy?
Well, if you ask me for my personal opinion, because this is what's so frustrating about these cases. There's never a really official investigation that takes it apart stone by stone, brick by brick. So it's left to people like me and Oliver to try and figure out what happened. I believe that if you try and put these pieces together, it seems to me have been a cooperative project between the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon. Now the FBI, they would have been happy. Hoover would have been, happy to go. Was that you didn't even have to invite him to the party. Okay. And the CIA was doing domestic operations for surveillance. See, if you weren't around back then, you don't understand how volatile between the Vietnam riots and the civil rights demonstrations, how a lot of people thought that this was getting into a dangerous area, and these demonstrations were huge. Okay, I'm not talking a few hundred people or a few thousand people. I'm talking tens of thousands. In some cases, the Vietnam demonstrations were literally hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, were involved in these things. And King had come out against the Vietnam War.
That's when all the liberals abandoned.
And that's a very important point, that King had decided in 1967 that he was going to oppose the Vietnam War. And this, when he did that, that put the kibosh between him and Johnson. That was it. All right, because Johnson was busy escalating the Vietnam War. And so King also, with Bobby Kennedy, came up with the Poor People's March. So much for Chris Hedges. Bobby Kennedy and King had talked about this economic redistribution thing. And King had asked him, well, what do you think is the best way, to get something like this going? And Bobby said, well, I thought your march on Washington was pretty successful, don't you? and, so, and, so, and so King then developed this idea about this poor people's demonstration. All right. And this is what he was working on. So the combination of these two things, this economic redistribution and his opposition to the Vietnam War, put King on the outside of, as long as Kennedy was there, all right, he had an entree into the White House and cooperation, and they could talk on the side and things like that, But once he did these two things, this made him a very, very powerful counterforce to the power corridors in Washington. And believe me, if you've ever seen these speeches on the Senate floor about the Poor People's March, they are really, really rabid, both before King died and after King died. All right. All right. And so these are the things he was doing. And these are the things I think that got the powers in Washington, to put it mildly, very upset with him. As long as King was doing the civil rights stuff, I think he would have been okay. But when he got involved with these two big national issues, I think that's what put him in the danger zone.
Yeah, because they had a lot of power to unite various groups of people also.
Right.
And so what did the civil case, the civil trial determine when they found for the plaintiff, right, for Pepper? What did Pepper allege was the role of the FBI?
Well, it's what I told you. He alleged that there was this broad conspiracy. And then the jury verdict came in and said they agreed with this high-level, broad conspiracy, including the Pentagon, okay, in the plot to murder Dr. King. All right. There's actually a transcript of the trial called The 13th Juror, if any of your listeners or viewers want to read the transcript. All right. And the best book on this subject is by a guy named John Avery Emerson, called The Congressional King Cover-Up. All right. And I think that's the best book on the King case.
Okay. Well, Jim, I would definitely love to have you back. And I know my viewers would love to have you in real time so they can ask some questions in the chat.
My pleasure. Be glad to do it.
Great. Thank you so much. And we will talk again soon.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye. And that was Jim DiEugenio. Next up is my interview with Peter Cohen, a sociologist and retired professor at the University of Amsterdam. He was a hidden child during the Holocaust and is an anti-Zionist. What happened to your family and to you during the Holocaust?
Yeah, most of my family was killed, but my parents were not. Speaking about this makes me very emotional. The story is complicated. My parents decided that they wouldn't listen to the commands of the Jewish Council. I don't know if you ever heard about Jewish councils in Europe.
Yes, but could you mind, because not everyone knows what they are.
Jewish councils were bodies of 12 to 15 Jews who would communicate to the Jewish population for the German occupier. So they basically commanded all the Jews to go to the stations from where they would be transported to the camps. And they threatened the Jews who didn't do that. They forbade the Jews to hide for the Germans, because according to them, this would be dangerous. So many Jews reacted to the commands of the Jewish Council. They were rabbis, they were important traders, bankers, which cost them their lives. So in Holland, about 100,000 Jews were killed of the 120,000 just because they listened to the commands of the Jewish Council. And Hannah Arendt has written about this, and she was not supposed to write about this stuff, and it cost her dearly. And okay, so my parents were hiding, and when I was a few months old, they gave me to a young family, which became my step-parents for 3.5 years. And they took me under their care and guidance. And I lived in the family farms. It was a big agricultural family. And I didn't suffer at all. My parents suffered because they had to hide and there was a food shortage. But I was in conditions of, in the agricultural world, they always had plenty of food and they cared for themselves. And so I never had any problem. I was never threatened. I could play with the animals. And the interesting thing is that at the farm, in one of the barns, lived about 20 German soldiers who were manning the anti-aircraft guns that were placed in the fields behind the farm. So I don't remember much about this, but I seem to have played a lot with these German soldiers, which is, of course, a strange thing in itself, but it was also a perfect hiding. But most of my family, both in Austria, where my mother came from, and in the Netherlands, didn't survive.
And what happened to them?
They were all exterminated in the extermination project of this racist ideology. It was not the Germans who were doing this. It was mainly the Nazi Party and the SS, which was a selection of Nazis, about 2 million of the German population, that executed all this.
And what was it that made your parents decide not to listen to the council? Do you know, did they ever talk about this with you?
Yes. My father was very trusting of the Jewish elite who were telling the people what to do. But my mother wasn't. So she said to my father, don't. And he listened to her, and it saved his life.
And where did they hide when they were in hiding?
They were hiding in a small town called Alphen aan de Rijn with a family who were working class people in one of the factories in Alphen aan de Rijn. That family, or a few families, they were hiding 16 Jews for the 3 years that they had to hide.
Were your parents' lives very shaped by the Holocaust, by
Yes.
the loss of their relatives? How did that impact them emotionally, and I guess also, if it did at all, politically?
No, politically, my father was a social democrat before the war, during the war, and after the war. They were not very, no Zionists. They were not Zionists. Only the sister of my father was a Zionist for a very short time. She left for Palestine and she returned within half a year, saying that it was awful there.
When was
And
this? What year?
1947 or 48.
Yeah. And how did it shape your parents, do you think, this experience?
Yeah, it impacted them in a way that they were always on the lookout. They had some kind of attitude towards life in which each moment something catastrophic could happen. And this never left them. It wasn't very serious, but it was there all the time.
And I'm sorry to ask you this question, but do you mind just sharing which relatives you lost? Like if it was your grandparents, your aunts and uncle, your...
Yeah, I mean, I haven't known many family members. Almost all of them perished. The two sisters of my father, they survived, but the whole family and the grandparents not.
And would your parents talk about their relatives who were killed?
No, they would never discuss them.
And when did you become critical of Israel or just start even thinking about Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, when I was 18 and the year that I would go to university, my mother's sister, who married an Austrian builder, invited me to Israel. And there he showed me in the hills around Tel Aviv, rather proudly, the destroyed villages of the Palestinians who had lived there. It was a barren countryside. And then I immediately knew that this was sinister and horrible. So, I mean, my first meeting with Israel was not at all romantic. It put me straight into the horror of that destruction.
And before that point, what was your understanding of Israel?
None. Because I was not living in a Zionist environment. I didn't go to a Jewish school where the only topic used to be, or still is, Israel and being a Jew. But fortunately, I wasn't raised in such surroundings. So I was simply integrated into Dutch education with all kinds of people from the Dutch colonies, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, extremely mixed and multicultural.
And what made you decide to speak out or write about what Israel was doing? And when was the first time that you did that?
During my student days, I, of course, met a lot of people who were critical of Israel and working for Palestine. But it didn't have much of my attention for some reason. I mean, I had decided to turn my back completely to Israel after that first experience. And I focused on many other things. I focused on opposition to the war in Vietnam. And later I was very much against the formation of the European Union because of its complete lack of democratic influence from parliaments and people. And I still see it as a horrible institution, the EU. So those were my focuses. And then I, of course, had a very intense professional life at the university in which I did many things, but mainly trying to design new theory about drugs and how it should be described in scientific terms and not in ideological terms. But I retired in 2004. And I think that the 2006 Lebanon war, which was terrible, it was a complete destruction of Lebanon, the bombing of close to 2 million fragmentation bombs all over Lebanon. And I decided that I would use my name to start opposing it. And I have done so ever since. The article that I sent you is actually the only article that I ever wrote. And it still functions for me. If people ask me, what do you think? I give them this HuffPo link. I tell them that I want Israel to not exist. The sacrifices that are made all over the globe, and certainly in the Middle East, in order to keep this Zionist terror going. The sacrifices for Zionism are simply huge, humongous. And so the best thing would be for the Zionist state to dissolve. And I wrote down why I think this and how it should happen.
And can you elaborate more on what it was that you witnessed in Israel as an 18-year-old?
Yeah, of course. I also traveled in Israel. And actually, I was in Dimona when they were building the nuclear reactor. And I spoke to many of the French engineers that were building it. I realized the same as with the ruins around Haifa, that this was going to be a catastrophe. So I was very awake in Israel. I liked the desert enormously. I found it a wonderful place to be in the desert. I went all the way to Eilat when I was 18, when Eilat was just a few huts.
And what year was this?
1960. It was very beautiful. But to me, Israel, I went there a few times after. It was always eerie. And the last time that I was in Israel was in 2003. And then I decided I would never set another foot on that fascist ground. I spoke to many people. I was horrified by the racism of the Israelis. And I just didn't want anything to do with it anymore. I was asked by the University of Beersheba to assist them in setting up some research. And, but I asked them not to use my name. I didn't want to be associated with, but then I decided if I don't want to be associated, I should not go into, shouldn't accept invitations, and I should never go again. So this is what I did.
And what brought you back there? How many times did you return after your first visit, and what would you do there?
I returned. I have been 3 times in Israel. In 1960, in 2001, I think, there was a big conference on MDMA use. And I was invited to do a talk in Jerusalem. Then I was there in 2003 or 4. I forgot the exact, when I was invited to assist the Beersheba University, which made me decide to never be there again. So all in all, I've been there 3 times.
Of course, I think they have a lot of research into things like MDMA because they have to, don't they have to like dull the trauma of their militarized state?
Yeah. It was all research connected to PTSD.
Right. So you were not a Zionist. Your parents were not Zionists. Were they anti-Zionists or just non-Zionists?
My parents were non-Zionists.
So it just
They
wasn't
were
even an issue for them.
no, no, and also I think that the adventures of my father's sister in Israel made them decide this was really nothing for them.
And what are your thoughts on the way that Israel and Zionists weaponize the Holocaust or use the Holocaust to justify Israel's existence and Israel's treatment of Palestinians?
Yeah, it's a political trick that I think is terrible. It is an abuse of the Holocaust for an abusive political system.
Do you think that Israel makes the world safer for Jews?
What do you think I'll say?
No.
Yeah, of course not. No, this nonsense that Israel is needed for the safety of the Jews has never been true. It has always been a completely invalid type of argumentation. Before the war, there is research by epidemiologists before the Second World War about where Jews from Europe and from England would go. And they would go to Argentina, to the United States, to Canada. But only a very small minority would go to Palestine. Of course, after the Second World War, with the idea that this could happen again, that people were looking for a safe place, I can understand that the argumentation of Israel being a safe place was taking hold in people. But everybody must have been able to see how Israel was being developed by racism, by discrimination, by ethnic cleansing, by land grabbing. So for me, it is quite difficult to identify with the people who would go there and feel safe in a place where the others were treated like slaves and like criminals. They didn't all call them terrorists. Now every Palestinian is a terrorist. But then they were just, they were nobodies. They were used as workers, but they were exploited. Everybody must have been able to see this. Creating a so-called safe place by basically disowning the people, the natives there, was something that I could never understand.
And did your parents ever become critical of Israel? Were they aware or conscious of the way that the thing that they survived, the Holocaust, was used to justify Israel?
No, my parents were simply not interested in the reasonings around Israel. My mother, because of her sister who was living in Israel, wasn't speaking in a negative way about Israel, but also not about a positive way. They visited once and they came back and they said, "I'm glad to be back." So there wasn't much criticism, but there also wasn't much enthusiasm.
Right. And how do you understand Zionism? If it's not about making Jews safe, what is it about?
It is ethnic nationalism, as was very common in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It was the ethnic nationalism and racism of the Jews. That's what Zionism is. You can only describe Zionism in terms of colonialism, racism, ethnocentrism. But in order not to do that, Zionism has developed a system of fairy tales about protecting the Jews, never speaking about the costs of protecting the Jews in this way, never comparing it to the other Jewish ideologies that existed before the war, the Bundists, who were simply want emancipation, certainly in Eastern Europe, where they didn't have equal rights. In Western Europe, after Napoleon, Jews had equal rights. And sometimes this wasn't very visible, and there were all kinds of discriminations. But in France, there were even stronger discriminations against Protestants, or against, how do you say, Roma?
Roma, yeah, the Roma, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Jews were not the only one who were discriminated against, if there was any discrimination. And later in France, a terrible discrimination against the people that fled Algeria because of the anti-colonial movement there. But these people were never really welcome in France. If the Jews make believe that they are always the subjects of discrimination, that is simply not true. Discrimination in Europe happened to very many categories of people, except for a period in Tsarist Russia and Ukraine and Poland. The discrimination of Jews in the rest of Europe was never lethal, was never violent. And still, France has one of the largest Jewish populations of Europe, over 400,000. The Netherlands has only about 35,000.
And what do you think can you talk about the solution to this problem that we're experiencing? You call it in this article, you write, the root cause is a never-ending conflict in Palestine and how to fix it. So can you share your thoughts as expressed there?
Yeah, I think that the partition of Palestine was an illegal act by the UN. UN didn't have the capacity nor the legal power to do that. The UN could only take decisions about the mandate territories that were inherited from the pre-Second World War period by asking the people what they wanted. So in Article 76, the UN should discuss with the inhabitants, with the population, if they want to remain under the tutelage of the mandate authority or become independent. This was never done in Palestine. So they never discussed what they decided about the partition. And I consider this a reason to make it illegal. But there is no higher authority in the world. You cannot go to a judge and say, what do you think about this decision? There is no global constitution against which you can measure the decisions of the UN. But if there were a higher authority than the UN General Assembly, you could ask, was this legal what they did in 1947? And the answer would be no. So Israel as a construction is not legitimate, and it has done everything during its existence to show how illegitimate it is. It is a murderous, lethal, racist survival of direct colonialism.
And how has your training as a sociologist, if at all, how has that shaped the way you understand and view Israel?
Yeah, in a particular way, it has helped me very much because, studying the theories about drug users and their personalities, I always understood that this was nonsensical. is that these were constructions like the constructions we used to make about witches, the women who would represent evil, and so trying to design research models from which the data would flow that could contradict the old-fashioned conventional theory about drugs and drug users made me a kind of specialist in looking at the nonsense in stories that people tell each other about something. I attacked very fiercely the medical constructions and the neurological constructions around drug users. And also in feminism, I had students who were feminists, and we studied texts. And I remember one text in which young women who would become pregnant outside a marriage, they were pathologized. These were women who had a lack of impulse
Control.
They were pathologized. Nowadays, of course, these theories are no longer used. They are recognized as the nonsense they are. I skilled myself.
Educating myself, schooled
I
myself.
educated myself in looking at the constructions. My thesis, also my doctoral thesis, was drugs as a social construct. So I could easily see the constructions in the Zionist theory and also in the Zionist history. All the nonsense, all the lying, all the propaganda. It was almost immediately clear for me from the moment that I read it. So I have never been, enthused. I have never been part of that whole fairy tale storytelling about Zionism and how necessary it was, because I almost immediately recognized the constructions. I didn't have to liberate myself from anything. Because I was never in it, and I always looked at it from the outside as a storytelling system, as a narrative that was extremely hiding the cruelty that Zionism in reality was.
And what do you think of the way people conflate and equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism?
Yeah, it's one of the tricks. So, I mean, I often write comments in Haaretz, the English version of Haaretz, and sometimes people react to my commenting, which is always anti-Zionist. And the first 3 years that I did this, I was almost always censored. And after 2014, 15, more of my comments survived the censoring system of Haaretz. Still, I write them, and still I'm thrown out, but then I repost them, and then they stay. But people react to my anti-Zionist and very sharp and sometimes aggressive comments that I am not a Jew. I am hiding with my name, Peter Cohen, as an Arab. I'm an Arab. Only Arabs can say such things. Yeah. It's amazing. So people have in their heads that Jews should support the Zionist constructions and the Zionist fairy tales and the Zionist religion. And this is a result of propaganda.
Do you ever get called a self-loathing Jew or a capo?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. That's what I usually get. I've never been accused of being Arab, but self-loathing Jew.
Yeah,
capo.
I'm a hidden Arab. Peter Cohen is actually an Arab.
Wow.
No, but I'm also called anti-Semite.
Right.
Yeah. And it simply doesn't touch me. I mean, I am kind of insensitive to this nonsense. When people say something like that, I smile.
Right. It's interesting. So you are very clear about your views not being kind of legitimized or justified by your family's experience during the Holocaust. So, for instance, in this Huffington Post article you wrote, there's an editor's note at the beginning. It says the author is a retired sociologist from the University of Amsterdam and a Jewish Dutch World War II survivor. He does not consider the latter relevant to his view on this topic, but we found it pertinent to include. And in an email to me, you said, I consider it wrong to construct my anti-Zionism as a product that exists in spite of the experience of general Jewish suffering during World War II. The conventional perspective erroneously constructs a normality. All Jews are or must be in favor of Israel because of the Nazi extermination project. So I agree with you, but I actually think that for that reason, it's important to not ground what you're saying necessarily in your experience, or not ground the legitimacy of what you're saying in your experience, but I do think it gives it an important, it's hard to say, because I don't mean that you have to have been a survivor. You don't even have to be Jewish, right? That's a problem, I think. Sometimes I struggle with that because I do speak out as a Jew. I don't just say I'm against Zionism or I'm against the occupation or I'm against the genocide. I do say sometimes, it depends on the context, but I will sometimes say as a Jew, right? And there are a couple of reasons I do that. One is strategy. I genuinely think that, and I've had debates with people on this. I had a debate with a very anti-Zionist rabbi named Yaakov Shapiro, who thinks that Jews should respond to Israel by just saying, like, we have nothing to do with it. That's, to me, that's kind of like unilateral disarmament, though, because if we do that, then the only Jews who are speaking about Israel are Jews defending Israel. And I think that that gives the world the impression that being Jewish means being Zionist, which I think, one, creates anti-Semitism. But honestly, my primary motivation is not about that. It's not a self-interest one. It's in solidarity with Palestinians. But I do think it's a helpful tool. And I know people who are Palestinian who are very grateful. I also know Palestinians who are frustrated by the need to be Jewish, to have, legitimacy in this area.
No, I know it exists. It is ferociously, how do you say, energized to make the connection. Zionism is being a Jew. It is part of the policies of Israel. It is everybody who is against Zionism because of its colonial horror cannot really be a mensch, because it's about Israel. When your name is Peter Cohen, as I am, I mean, I have never been able to escape from being a Jew. Everywhere I come and I say who I am, I'm a Jew. But I don't talk like a Zionist Jew. I talk like an anti-colonial, Marxist, politically interested guy. I find it sad that this propaganda trick has been so incredibly influential. But I understand what you say. And in a way, writing this Huffington Post article, which I couldn't publish anywhere. I tried Le Monde in France, I tried The Guardian, I tried a Dutch paper. Now, there is a German translation of it. It is impossible to publish such a view in Germany, because Germany is hallucinating about Zionism. But I think that what you are doing now, trying to dislodge the concept of Jew and the concept of Israel, is very important.
And I'm curious, when you were trying to get your article placed, did you frame it as, I mean, I would assume not, but I don't know. Did you say, I'm someone whose parents were hidden during the Holocaust? I was hidden during the Holocaust?
Never. And the original title that Huffington Post didn't want to use was, "This is not about peace." I'm not in favor of peace between the Palestinians and the Zionists. I'm in favor of throwing the Zionist invader out. It is liberation of Palestine. I'm not for them living quietly together, as friends, which is complete nonsense. I just tonight had dinner with an old man, I told you, who was born in the Dutch Indies. He lived very long in the Dutch Indies until the Dutch Indies threw all the Dutch out. Hundreds of thousands of them in 1958. The Algerians have thrown out all the French, 3 million. It can be done. And most of the Israelis that I know, also the ones that are very critical, they all have double passports. They all somehow in the back of their head reckon with Israel and its horror being too much for the world and too much for the Muslim population in the area. But the West is very strong, and the West has, the British have always used their colonies to exploit, to make an imperium in which they were almost invincible. And the conquest of the Middle East was an enormous enlargement of their power. They had Egypt, but they never had everything between Egypt and, so they also invaded Afghanistan to make this complete land bridge between the Middle East, between England, the Middle East, Cyprus. They would have everything. And Palestine is just like Northern Ireland, a bridgehead, a colonial bridgehead. And they used the Zionists to execute this. The colonial foothold, yes.
Foothold,
so
right.
Yeah.
What
So
was it, right?
the British cooperated with the Zionists to keep Arab nationalism at bay.
Right.
They used the Muslims in India to struggle to fight against Indian nationalism, Hindu. So they have always done this, what the Romans already did, dividing populations, using minorities. The Shia majority was always under other types of Muslim denominations to keep them down. So for me, the only valid language, the only reasonable language to discuss Zionism is the language of colonialism. And the Zionists never use the language of colonialism. They say you're an anti-Semite if you say that Israel is a colony.
And it's also ironic because equating Zionism with being Jewish or implying or stating out loud, like explicitly, that it is anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist, the premise of that is that being Jewish means being Zionist. Yeah. And the irony of that is that's like an old anti-Semitic trope and stereotype, the dual loyalty trope, right? I mean,
yeah, it is. I mean, there is nothing fantasy about the dual loyalty, which is not existing in Israel. I know many Jews here in Holland who would say if they would have to choose, they would choose for the interests of Israel and not for the Netherlands.
Right. Yeah, there's a dual loyalty, but a dual loyalty for Zionists, not for Jews, per se.
Yeah, for Zionists, yes.
Yeah, and that's the anti-Semitic myth, is that it's a Jewish thing to support Israel as opposed to a Zionist political thing to do it.
Listen, the Zionists have always equated Zionism and Jewishness. So I don't see that it is anti-Semitic. It is an intentional, how do you say, collation? No.
Conflation?
Conflation of the two.
Right.
Zionist propaganda has always been the Jewish organizations of the world support Israel.
Right.
This has always, so it's not anti-Semitic, it is Zionist propaganda.
Right, but I guess it's funny to me because they're happy to lean into this narrative that happens to be. I mean, it's an interesting sign when the people who conflate Jewishness with Zionism are like raging anti-Semites, right? The KKK, right? Who say the Zionist this, the Zionist that, and then Israel, the ADL and AIPAC. Like, I think it's a sign that a couple of things. One is a sign that Zionists don't actually care about anti-Semitism, because they actually need it, right, for the political project to continue.
Take anti-Semitism out of the equation. It is a Zionist product regenerated every day to make the conflation Zionism and Jews. AIPAC is a Jewish organization. All these organizations of rabbis, we are the Jews of America. And we support Zionism. They always do this. So the construction that Zionism and Jewishness is equal comes from the Zionists, not from the anti-Semites. Although I have never met an anti-Semite. I mean, there is anti-Semites everywhere, and people who are critical of Zionism. Maybe they say this because they are anti-Semites.
I mean, I think some people out there are anti-Semites, but that has nothing to do with, I mean, anti-Semites come in all different political.
Yeah. And there are people who are anti-Catholic, and there are people who are anti-communist, and there are people who are anti-blacks, and there, I mean, there's all kinds of discrimination and racism going on.
Right. Two things are happening. One thing is that, like, Zionists cry wolf all the time, and they claim everything is anti-Semitic, right? Anything that's critical. But a sad irony is that I do think that the more Israel live streams its genocide, claiming to act in the name of Jews, like I've said this before, like, you know, my primary motivation when I speak out as a Jew is
not in my
sorry,
not in my name, you say.
Yeah, not in my name, right? Not in my name, right? But for the first time since October 7th, I actually do feel like, and this isn't my primary motivation, but this is the first time I feel like there is actually potentially a self-interest there, because the genocide and the violence, the racism, the exterminationist nature of Zionism is so obvious to the world. And Israel can't get away with saying that it's acting in the name of Jews because it's wrong. But I actually, for the first time, feel like, for the sake of Jewish safety, which is not something I've ever really thought about growing up in New York City as a Jew. I mean, you know, but
do you see signs of it? Do you feel threatened yourself? Have you ever been
I don't know. I don't, but I don't know. I am worried that it will create a backlash. And
no, but the worry in itself is already, I think, is wrong. Don't worry. You speak out in the way you do. You try to disrupt this automatic identification between Jews and Zionists, and you say this is nonsensical. Half of the Jews, or even more of the Jews of the world, which are only 18 million, live outside the original Zionists. Not one of them who were in the European Zionist movement wanted to live in Palestine.
Right. Yeah.
So don't be afraid, because your fear will influence what you say and what you do. You have to fight for dislodging this connection. I am anti-Zionist. I speak to everybody who wants to hear it and discusses with me what I think. Yeah. And I never have felt any aggression towards me because I'm a Cohen.
Right.
Because and everybody has seen what is happening in Palestine. Now, this is one of the great advantages of the October 7th stuff, in which very many Jews were killed by the Israeli army.
Right. The Hannibal Directive was used, yeah.
Yeah, massively.
Right.
We don't know exactly how many Jews were killed by the Israeli army,
But they
but
weren't.
it must have been very many because they don't allow any investigations into
Right.
October 7th.
Right.
So the Israelis are criminals and they are racist, genocidal culture, and we have to get rid of it. We cannot say we have to work on a better Israel because Zionism makes it impossible because it is the DNA of Zionism to be supremacist and racist and apartheid. It can't be separated.
Can you tell, going back to your youth, can you tell me more about the family that hid you?
Yeah, they were very Orthodox Protestant Christians. And, they would speak with God twice a day during the midday meal and during the evening meal. Once I took my daughter to one of the meals and when she was 6 years old, and there was a big Bible, a huge old-fashioned Bible, and it was opened. And then some lines were read, and then Jacob, his name, would say, God, today Peter has come back. We haven't seen him for some months. It's always nice to see him. And he has taken his daughter. And then my daughter asked, but who is he talking to? She asked. I told her, quiet, quiet. I will explain to you later.
Hilarious.
So this is the Christianity of this family. They would have a direct dialogue with God twice a day. And during the Sundays, we would go, I remember very well, we would go twice to the church and listen to the preacher. And I could always play in the church. I was running around. And I mean, they also had some kind of informality, but they were extremely religious.
And how old were you when you started staying with them?
A few months. And I left when I was over 3.5.
3.5, you said?
Yeah.
And did you have any consciousness of, like, I'm trying to remember when you're that old. Did you think they were your parents? What were you thinking?
They were my parents. And my uncles and my nieces. There were also older children in the family. And we would play, and we would play with the animals. And I would, later, when I was older, I would also, because, in the 50s, Dutch agriculture was still very rural. And everything was done with horses and carts. And I would drive the horses and the carts. I would be part of this agricultural life. I would never be, they never spoke to me as a Jewish boy. I was just one of them. And this is how I felt.
And how did your parents find them?
An organization, a resistance, the Dutch resistance.
So they were in the resistance, these Protestants.
Yes.
They weren't Catholic. I mean, they weren't communists.
No, they were not communists, but the communists were the driving force of the
Right.
Dutch resistance.
Right.
But also there was Catholic resistance.
Right.
And they would sometimes cooperate, sometimes work on their own. Something that I wanted to tell you is that here in Amsterdam, there is a Jewish high school. And it used to be just a building on one of the canals. But in the 80s or 90s, the Orthodox Jews the Zionist community decided to build a new building for this college. And they built it a little bit south of Amsterdam in a walled, they raised an enormous wall with where you can stand and where you can look. And the kids that go to this school are educated as Zionist Jews that always have to be on the lookout for danger. There is no danger for Jews in Amsterdam. None.
Oh, right. Even though they really did a great job pretending. What was that age? The Maccabee games.
Yeah.
That was.
The Maccabee fans came here and made an incredible mess. You know, here in Amsterdam, you see Palestinian flags all over the place.
Right.
And they started to erase them and attack people who said, "What are you doing?" And then they were a bunch of hooligans.
Yeah.
And then people started to defend themselves.
Right.
And it was, the narrative was that it was pogrom against Jews.
Yeah, I had on. Do you know Mouin Rabbani? He's actually Dutch Palestinian. I don't know if you've ever seen him. And he made this really. I had him on to talk about it, and he made this excellent point, which is that like this was so clearly not about anti-Semitism because that same night there was a commemoration, I guess, of Kristallnacht at I think a famous Amsterdam synagogue, and there was nothing there. And if people, if this were motivated by anti-Semitism, of course they would have shown up there.
So all the Jewish institutions here are completely safe.
Yeah.
There has, except for one time in a kosher restaurant where they threw some anti-Zionist slogans, which was constructed immediately as anti-Semitism. But according to my best knowledge, Jews are safe in the Netherlands as they are almost everywhere in Europe, and never as unsafe as they are in the Zionist paradise.
Right. So when did you understand that these people who took you in weren't your parents, and how were you told that?
Yeah, because in August 1945, when I was 3.5 years old, my father, who had survived, came to pick me up and put me on a bicycle and drove me off to Alphen aan den Rijn, where they would live, without saying anything. Yeah. So I was, how do you say, abducted. And my stepmother, she almost died because of grief. And this is very heavy.
They just didn't know how to navigate that or process that?
No. So you can imagine how much impact this had on me. I was simply taken out of my habitat. I think in the end, I did relatively well, but
that sounds really traumatizing.
It is very traumatizing, I can tell you.
But you were allowed to maintain a relationship with them.
Yes.
That's nice.
Yeah. So they're now both dead, but I've been seeing them all my life until they died. And I took care of my stepmother because she didn't have any family. So I did everything that a son would do to make life agreeable for an elderly person. And she became very ill and she had Alzheimer.
Mm.
She had a very difficult old age. But so I accompanied her until her death. And my stepfather, who was a homosexual, he lived after his retirement very strongly integrated into the farmer's family. And so he was taken care of by his own family, but my stepmother didn't have any family.
So they were together?
They were together during the war, but they separated in the early 50s, 51 or something.
Okay.
And then I didn't see much of my stepfather, but I saw him once in a while when I went to the farm or to one of the family farms, because it was a system of 6 farms.
Was he allowed, quote unquote, allowed? I mean, did the Protestant community accept him after he came out as gay? No.
No, he never came out.
Oh, he didn't come out. You just
No,
you just know he was gay. Okay, got it.
Yeah. my stepmother told me, but he never came out. He always lived as a widow, kind of widow in the family. He worked as a teacher and then as a head teacher. And I didn't have much contact with him compared to the very steady contacts I always had with my stepmother.
It's interesting. So before you use the word mensch, and I'm wondering if you feel like you have a Jewish identity, and also if you feel like there's any kind of Jewish tradition that you identify with that maybe compels you. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but do you feel like partially that because of what Jews did go through, do you feel like the sense of never again, for instance, does that resonate with you? Like, and if so, what does it mean to you, never again?
I don't believe in never again.
You know, it's funny.
Genocide is so human. There will be genocides all the time. Maybe less than there were in the past, but we are looking at a genocide now, a power destroying everything, roads, systems, education, hospitals, everything, people. And nothing happens. The West has always been an incredibly cruel colonialist power.
Right.
If you see how many Arabs the French killed in Algeria, how many Koreans were killed by the Americans because they wanted to be independent. Over 2 million. How many people were killed by the German colonialists in German Africa? So
Which never gets talked about. Yeah.
I don't believe in this fairy tale of never again.
Mm.
I believe in organizing power that it happens less or is far more difficult for it to happen. But never again. And America is sending thousands of genocidal bombs to the Israeli army. Israel is just a product of Western colonialism, and it still is. And it is still extremely functional for the United States to dominate and to create chaos in the Middle East so that it can be dominated.
Right. And do you think though does your
wait a minute.
Oh.
You asked me something about mensch.
Oh yeah.
I learned the word mensch in New York.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
From friends that I visited and colleagues. Some of them were Jews and they were using the word mensch. And of course, I understood that. But in Dutch, in Amsterdam, because there were so many Jews, there are also many Yiddish words. So the word schlemiel.
Right.
Everybody in Amsterdam uses schlemiel.
Right.
It is part of the Dutch culture or the Amsterdam culture, because Amsterdam was very heavily painted by Jewish cuisine. And
right. Did your parents speak Yiddish?
No.
Okay.
No, not a word. My mother was from Vienna. She escaped Austria after the First World War, but she spoke Dutch. She was in Holland since she was 8, so she didn't have any accent.
Does anything about being saved by others, does that give you, do you think, any sense of kind of, I mean, you're obviously anti-colonial, right, in your political thinking, but I'm wondering if speaking out has anything to do with doing something.
Doing something. People cannot be silent.
Yeah.
And I consciously decided to use my name to say unspeakable things about Zionism and about Israel. And my Huffington Post article, which was considered in 2009 as completely unspeakable, the demise, throwing the Jews out of Israel, Can you imagine someone saying that? The Nazi? Yeah.
Right.
But I have simply, I thought I can say it. I do not have a Jewish identity.
You don't. Interesting.
I don't think that I have.
Mhm.
I was never impregnated with one. I have always lived among all kinds of people here in the city, in the university, in the world. I never identified with Jewish causes. Never
Well, it's fun-
identified with Zionism. What's funny?
Well, no, because I'm to the extent that I have a Jewish identity, which I do feel like I have one, and you may think, okay,
What does it mean?
it's like a lefty secular Ashkenazi culture.
What is Ashkenazi?
Do you, like,
I know the word Ashkenazi, but what is Ashkenazi about your leftist?
I'm just saying it's actually like usually when people talk about a Jewish identity, it's also very much a New York thing, I think.
Yeah, maybe
Maybe there are cultural codes here that don't exist as much in other places.
Like what?
I don't know. There's the humor, there's the food.
Yeah, of course. People have characteristics. The Scots have, the Irish have, the music is Scots or Irish.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, but, and you can have a certain affinity with it.
Yeah.
And Jewish humor, you can have affinity with it. But does that give you a Jewish identity? I mean, it is part of your culture.
Yeah.
Using certain jokes, using certain words like mensch.
Yeah.
In New York, they use it often. And, but also the non-Jews.
Right. And that's the thing is like, I'll send you a link to a documentary I made. But, I went to this secular Jewish socialist summer camp that was founded in the 1920s by communists, basically. And it was Jewish. I mean, they spoke Yiddish, right? But at the same time, part of their Jewishness was that from the beginning, it was integrated. Like they had Black people at the camp from the beginning. It's an identity that is all about not being supremacist or divisive. It's like a very internationalist, solidaristic identity. So.
Okay, but there's also Jews who don't speak about anything else but their Jewishness.
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah, that's not my Jewishness.
No.
Yeah.
So I would say that is maybe a Jewish identity, but that you pick up stuff from Jews around you, certainly in New York. I mean, I am not really very clear about what it could mean, a Jewish identity, but I'm sure that I don't have one.
Yeah.
I have a Jewish name.
Right.
And people maybe construct me as a Jew, which I am not. I am not. I don't have any faith. I am completely secular.
That's so Jewish. That's very Jewish. Just kidding.
What?
I'm just joking. I'm saying that's very Jewish to be.
To be non-Jewish.
Yeah, to be not religious. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I believed in something. It would probably offer a lot of solace.
No, you believe in progressive ideals, changing some of the horrors of the world. You believe in enough stuff to give you a focus. But I have known many communists, also very important ones here in the Netherlands, and they really believed in the downfall of capitalism.
Right.
And I have often compared it to a religious belief. And maybe some of our political convictions have somewhat the characteristics of a religion, because, and sometimes we hope against realism.
Right. And that was my interview with Peter Cohen, a sociologist, retired professor at the University of Amsterdam, and a hidden child during the Holocaust, and an anti-Zionist. Thanks so much for watching The Katie Halper Show. Remember to subscribe and like the show. That really helps us reach more people. Also support the show at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. For just $1 a month, you get to support the show. And if you do $5 a month, you get major bonus content. And you give yourself the gift of extended interviews, extra interviews. And it's a great deal, if I do say so myself. For this week, the Patreon consists of great little interviews I did at the first Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress here in Vienna. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Thanks so much, everyone, and see you next week. Bye. And next week, we will have another live show. And of course, we'll be talking about all the current events. Okay, bye for real now.